At some point in our lives, we've probably all been at least a little angry at the folks in charge. Yet even today's most unpopular leaders have nothing on these guys. The Terrible in Ivan the Terrible is probably better translated as awe-inspiring, but that doesn't mean he wasn't also terrible in the modern sense of the word. Ivan IV held something of a dislike for the bickering boyars who made up the Russian nobility, and so he decided he should try to kill as many of them as he could. Some were supposedly executed for treason, while others were killed so that Ivan could clear territory around Moscow for his own personal rule. To consolidate his control over Russia, he also established his own secret police. Called Oprichniki, they imposed Ivan's will on the kingdom and helped him carry out the brutal sack of Novgorod in 1570. Ivan's home life was no better. Henry VIII of England gets a lot of flack for his 6 wives, but Ivan had at least that many, with most of them preceding him in death. And then, in 1581, he made the mother of all royal mess-ups by flying into a blind rage and accidentally killing his son. That's where the modern sense of terrible comes in. With his best choice for a successor eliminated, Ivan was unable to prevent the dawn of an even darker period in Russian history, the Time of Troubles. The wars that define this time are estimated to have claimed over 1 million lives, some regions of Russia losing more than 50% of their population. Terrible work, Ivan.
Let them eat cake.
I mean, do I have to say anything else? Can we just move on to the next one? Alright, fine. Well, here's an interesting part to the story you might not know. Louis XVI wasn't actually that unpopular in the early days of the French Revolution, as people generally reserved their ire for his advisors, and of course his cake-loving wife. In fact, Marie Antoinette acted as a kind of nexus point for unpleasant rumors about the French aristocracy. Regardless of their accuracy, enough of the French disliked her enough to inflame their revolutionary passions even further. In June 1791, Louis and Marie decided to make a break for it, bolting toward the Austrian Netherlands in the hopes that they could raise an army and topple the revolutionary government. They got caught just short of the border, and public opinion towards the king soured immediately. Now seen as a man willing to abandon his people and subject them to foreign invasion, Louis found himself unprotected by the French people's former goodwill. He went to the guillotine in January 1793, while his unlucky queen followed him later that year. Hard to spell and even harder to say, the Ceaușescus governed Romania during the late 1980s, a time when communist governments across Eastern Europe stood on the brink of collapse. In capitals across the Warsaw Pact, popular protests led to the toppling or retreat of Soviet-aligned dictators, a process that was generally non-violent, with the exception of Romania. In 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu ordered the use of deadly force to suppress protests in the Romanian city of Timișoara. The death toll numbered in the dozens at the very least, and so when Ceaușescu returned to Romania from an official visit to Iran, he found that pretty much everyone was furious at him. When the army joined the growing protests, Nicolae and his wife Elena decided to flee the capital, only to be arrested in the countryside and returned to Bucharest under army custody. Violence between security forces loyal to the Ceaușescus and their opponents spread across Romania, and so on Christmas Day, the Romanian people got an unexpected gift: a televised show trial of the dictator and his wife.
If you consider all the atrocities he committed, I'd say only one charge was possible: crimes against humanity.
After a guilty verdict was returned, the Ceaușescus were sentenced to death by firing squad. They were led into a courtyard and stood up next to the restrooms. Nicolae sang the communist hymn, the Internationale. Elena, somewhat less composed, swore angrily at her executioners. A hail of bullets then sent the couple to whatever reward awaited them. King Charles I screwed up the 2 aspects of his reign that an early modern king really couldn't afford to screw up: religion and money. Charles loved ornate high church worship and had married a Catholic, which was considered to be fairly suspect in Protestant England and Ireland. He also enjoyed spending money, especially on art. Frustrated with Parliament trying to limit his powers and spending, he attempted to rule without his legislature for 11 years, only recalling it when he needed money. Tension over these finances soon became tension over Charles's authority, and in the summer of 1642, violence that sparked in Scotland and Ireland became an open war that engulfed all 3 of Charles's kingdoms. The complex system of civil wars that ensued became known to later scholars as the Wars of the 3 Kingdoms, as armies smashed into each other across the British Isles. Charles' supporters in England were largely defeated by 1646, yet he continued to seek negotiations that might allow him to remain in charge. He botched this so badly, though, that England and Scotland actually fought a brief war in 1648, despite the fact that Charles was king of both countries. This led the English parliamentary army to push for Parliament to order Charles's death. Over a few objections, they obliged, and Charles I met the axe in January 1649.
Such an institution is known as democracy, sir.
If you know what Jezebel means today, you know where this is going. Jezebel was a princess of Tyre, a region in modern-day Lebanon, who married King Ahab of Israel. In the Bible, Ahab quickly erected a temple of Baal, which in a Bible story is usually how you know things are about to go south. According to the biblical narrative, Queen Jezebel appears to have struggled for influence with Elijah, a prophet of the Israelite God. She apparently connived to have a man killed so that she and Ahab could acquire his vineyard. After Ahab's death, Elijah crowned a rival successor to Ahab and Jezebel's son, Joram. This successor, Jehu, killed Joram in battle and marched into the Jezreel Valley to take on Jezebel herself. And spoiler alert, Jezebel lost. She was then thrown out of a window, trampled by horses, and eaten by dogs, making for one of the most compelling deaths in a book that does not lack for dramatic exits. For those of you who didn't know where this was going, since the 14th century, Jezebel's name has been an epitaph for quote-unquote bad women in the English language, which probably isn't a legacy you'd hope to leave.
Oh, sip it, Jezebel.
Still, it's not all bad. Those who are more sympathetic to the fate of this sharp-tongued queen will be glad to know that her name is also used for several species of colorful butterflies. Constantinople's most famous fall occurred in 1453, but a prequel had taken place some 250 years earlier. Before then, the city of the world's desire had long stood against its many besiegers, but it finally fell against an army of Western crusaders who were desperate to earn some cash and pay off their debts to the Venetian government. Yet the instability caused by the fall of Constantinople provided something of an opportunity for Alexios V Doukas. The Doukases were one of the great Byzantine families. Alexios V landed on the Byzantine throne in early 1204, having killed the father and son rulers Isaac II and Alexios IV, who'd been installed by the Crusaders when they first took Constantinople. Alexios failed to keep out the Crusader army, though, who now had a reason to sack the city for a second time. The army battered down 2 gates and stripped the city bare in a frenzy of both plunder and violence. Alexios briefly escaped to Thrace, but he was caught and then blinded by Alexios III. Man, so much blinding back in those days. Incidentally, Alexios III had been a former emperor himself. After that, he was returned to the city he'd bungled away. Indicted by the Crusaders for the killing of his predecessor, Alexios, the blinded one, was found guilty, marched to the top of a column in Constantinople, and thrown to his death. Madagascar is a fascinating place for many reasons. It's got lemurs, fossa, and perhaps one of the most frightening queens to ever sit on a throne, Ranavalona I. In the early 19th century, a local Malagasy ruler named Radama used the aid of the British to unite and conquer the rest of the island. When he died young in 1828, his widow, Ranavalona, took over. Ranavalona wasn't interested in British help, growing influence of the French, or even Christianity. She wanted to rule united and shut off Madagascar, and she was willing to do whatever it took to achieve it. In real terms, this mostly meant sticking the heads of European invaders on spikes and extracting forced labor from the Malagasy population. Some of Ranavalona's exploits were likely exaggerated in European accounts. That said, Ranavalona had plenty of tangible flaws as a queen. She and her successors ruled over an island that is estimated to have seen flat population growth from 1820 to 1895, for example, mostly due to constant warfare, the aforementioned forced labor, and a weird insistence on using poisonous fruit as the basis for the country's legal system. In other words, everybody stayed dying off constantly during her family's reign over Madagascar. Say what you will about the Roman matron Julia Mesa, but she didn't lack ambition. When a power vacuum emerged at the heart of the empire, she claimed her grandson was the illegitimate son of a recent emperor with enough vim that said grandson made it onto the Roman throne in AD 217. Unfortunately, Elagabalus' reign didn't last all that long. The teenage emperor was too wild, weird, and queer for the Roman upper crust. He sometimes used female dress and pronouns through bizarre parties featuring strange foods and endless cavorting, and attempted to bring the Levantine god Baal into Roman life. In case you forgot what AD meant, those Christians weren't too keen on that, much less the regular Roman citizens with all their gods and such. He also married one of the Vestal Virgins, whose chastity was crucial to Roman state religion, and had a number of generals killed. In 222, the Praetorian Guard decided they'd had enough of Elagabalus and killed both him and his mother. Elagabalus was then subjected to a process later known as damnatio memoriae, or condemnation of memory, a practice in which the Romans attempt to obliterate the memory of an unpopular figure by removing their image and name from public spaces. They weren't entirely successful, of course, and the complex legacy of Elagabalus' brief reign still fascinates classicists some 1800 years later. Families can be complicated, and royal families especially so, but it takes something special to end up overthrown by your own wife. Edward II of England was a handsome musical animal lover. Unfortunately for his political fortunes, he was also gay and quite fond of bad boys. As soon as Edward I died in 1307, the new king called his favorite, Piers Gaveston, back from the exile that had been ordered by his predecessor. Edward II gave his beau the Duchy of Cornwall, among many other special favors, which so enraged the existing English nobility that they just up and killed Gaveston in 1312. Apparently learning nothing from all this, Edward II found another special friend, Hugh Despenser, in 1318. Despenser hated Edward's wife, Queen Isabella of France. Among other slights, he had her children removed from her care. Isabella went to France on a diplomatic errand in 1325, later sending for her son and the king's heir, Prince Edward. And as soon as she got her hands on the young Edward, she set about organizing an invasion of England. Edward and Hugh were removed from power. Hugh was hanged, drawn, and quartered by his enemies, while Edward was replaced by the 14-year-old Edward III in 1327. Legend has it that Edward II was killed that year by having a hot poker inserted into his rectum. Luckily for him, this is probably myth. He was more likely killed by suffocation, as earlier accounts reports, although some historians have suggested that he may have lived on for a number of years.